Okay, so I'm here with Sergei Leshchenko. Sergei was a Draper Hill Summer Fellow at CDDRL, the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, back in 2013. At that time, he was a Ukrainian journalist. He subsequently went into the Ukrainian parliament, and he's been at the center of a lot of the controversy over Ukraine that's now come up in the impeachment hearings for Donald Trump. He has been accused regularly by many Trump supporters of meddling in American politics because of his early role in revealing the so-called Black Ledger. And we're very glad that he's back at Stanford so that he can correct the record, because I think many of these accusations completely misunderstand who is it that's really corrupt in Ukraine and how the Ukrainian events have impacted the domestic American events, which I think in the end is very unfortunate for Ukraine, because there was a very strong bipartisan consensus in support of Ukraine against Russia up until these recent few weeks. So Sergei, why don't we just begin? Maybe you can explain, the origins of these charges and your role in revealing all of this information that came out about Manafort and corruption issues in Ukraine.
Frank, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a huge honor to be back, and the role the center playing, you personally playing in Ukrainian transformation is really huge, because a lot of people from civil society, journalism, joined politics just after your classes. So your encouraging efforts played really huge role for this transformation in Ukraine. And let me start with the Black Ledger issue. Just to explain in small details that Black Ledger is not official document. It's a handwritten 800 pages, which were taken from former Ukrainian President Party office. And these papers were just to collect money, to understand how money this government, the Yanukovych government and his leadership spent for bribery, for political purpose. That is why Black Ledger is quite mystical document. You cannot use this as official proof just because it's not a bank records. But we know now that some records from Black Ledger connected with official payment from offshore companies for Paul Manafort account in US. So it's totally relevant, and FBI proved this when they conducted investigation against Paul Manafort. Important to understand that Black Ledger is not about American politics. It's about Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian corruption. And one of the person who made former Ukrainian president successful in political sense, who helped him to be elected as a president, to be re-elected as a prime minister, it's Mr. Manafort. And Manafort was paid from former Ukrainian government, but it was not the real payment for political consulting. It was fraud invoices with fraud documents, and for instance, one of the Black Ledger payment for $750,000, it was payment not for political consulting, but for selling computers from Mr. Manafort to offshore company with a shady account in one of Central Asia countries. It's just one example which create the way to understand that Black Ledger is how to calculate money for political bribery or for political purpose, but not to use this as a direct proof of the corruption. Corruption has to be investigated using these records, and American law enforcement institution investigated this, and Mr. Manafort was found guilty by your American legal system.
Yeah,
and
by a jury in Virginia.
Yes, and Ukraine was not really the country would like to push investigation about Manafort forward. Ukraine was interested to investigate Ukrainian corruption. And when Mr. Manafort was found in these Black Ledger records, for me, as a former journalist, of course it was important, but for Ukrainian law enforcement institution, it was not a big deal. He was never prosecuted in Ukraine just because he was not Ukrainian citizen. Mm-hmm. I wish we have to investigate Ukrainian corrupt politicians or government officials.
And who was the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor at the time that this information came out?
It was anti-corruption bureau, a newly established law enforcement institution, and they were focused on Ukrainian side, on Ukrainian officials. Mr. Manafort, now let's say that there are some investigations still going on, but it has to be relevant to Ukrainian, Ukrainian money, Ukrainian violation of Ukrainian law. And when his name was found in this black ledger, it was done not by myself. Frankly speaking, I had my 22 pages of records. It was May 2016 when I made them public. But Mr. Manafort, fortunately or unfortunately, was not mentioned in these 22 pages. If I had his name, of course, I made this name public as well, but I didn't have this name. When I published my 22 pages, it was about Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian judges, Ukrainian journalists corrupted by previous President Yanukovych. And then almost 3 months later, New York Times published their own story when they proved that Mr. Manafort was also mentioned in another pages apart from my 22 pages, because as I told, it's about 800 pages, the whole black ledger of unofficial records. After this, Ukrainian law enforcement institution, which was responsible for investigation at the time, they proved that Mr. Manafort is really mentioned. Then I made my press conference as a member of parliament, as an investigative journalist. I asked for investigation of these records. Mr. Manafort resigned, and FBI, I believe at that time they had some suspicions about Mr. Manafort. Maybe they started to look into details, dates, amounts of money, started to compare the dates, amounts of money, and they made indictment against Mr. Manafort.
Now, let me just clarify something, though. When the Republicans say that, when the intelligence community in the United States charges the Russians with having interfered in the election, this is a big event that was sponsored by the Russian government.
Of course.
They put millions of dollars into it. There's dozens of people working on it. It's a deliberate policy of the Russian government to try to affect the outcome of the American election. You, on the other hand, were just Sergei. I mean, you were a member of parliament, but you were not speaking on behalf of the Ukrainian government. You did not represent a coordinated effort by anyone on the Ukrainian side to try to influence the outcome of the American election.
Even more, I was very critical about former President Poroshenko, who was ruling Ukraine at the time. So yes, it's true that I was elected as a member of parliament by party list of Mr. Poroshenko political force. But 1 year before Black Ledger was published, I started to be very critical about him. And at the moment when I publicized my pages, 22 pages, I was almost like internal opposition to Mr. Poroshenko. It's important to understand some details, because if you look on the general view on the situation, it can be totally different experience if you go into the details, because details explain a lot. That I was very critical about Mr. Poroshenko as well. I was very critical about Mr. Yanukovych and his political consultant, Mr. Manafort. Mr. Poroshenko used to work as a minister in Yanukovych government. Paul Manafort proposed his service to Mr. Poroshenko. So it was like more or less the same political class, political establishment from 90s. And I was very critical about these people. I published my 22 pages with the idea to show that political establishment is very corrupt in Ukraine. At the same time, as a member of parliament, I had no ability to investigate this as a law enforcement person. But I provided my 22 pages to newly established anti-corruption bureau. They started some investigation. They made few indictments against Ukrainians. They never indicted Manafort just because Manafort was not Ukrainian citizen. For today, some investigation still going on. I have no idea how far they go with this investigation, just because I'm not member of parliament anymore. I have no access to these records. But it's important to understand that Black Ledger is about Ukrainian corruption, and Mr. Manafort was only one of few foreigners mentioned there. And I believe the role of Black Ledger was just to show the whole world how politics can be corrupt. And after this, American law enforcement institutions started to investigate maybe more deeply what is Mr. Manafort about, how he was paid. And they found him guilty because he accepted money from Ukrainian government, but this was not registered in US as a lobbyism, and it was no taxation in US, and he was found guilty. And he pled guilty, by the way, in some chapters of American criminal code. As for today, I believe it's important to explain for part of American political establishment that it's not a good idea to back Mr. Manafort or his behavior in Ukraine just because it was violation of law in US and he was paid by very corrupt president, and quite possibly this money was stolen from Ukrainian citizens because Mr. Yanukovych had his money from Ukrainian budget taken using different corrupt schemes.
Okay. Now, I know you were not directly involved in this aspect of the current scandal, but could you say a little bit about Rudy Giuliani's charge that somehow former Vice President Biden interfered in an ongoing corruption investigation of Burisma that would have involved his son Hunter, and just explain a little bit of that background?
I want to stress that from the beginning I was not really happy with the idea to have Hunter Biden in the board of a company called Burisma, because company called Burisma was established by one of the former Ukrainian officials who was also
Zlochevsky.
Yeah, his name is Mr. Zlochevsky. So many names for Americans to understand. That's why I'm avoiding this to mention this each next name, because I think it will be quite difficult to remember all these names. But this company, Burisma, it was not the startup company or company with a clean background. And there are still some investigation going on in Ukraine about this company. And Mr. Biden Jr. accepted this invitation. We should ask him what was his motivation. But in Ukraine, we were very critical. What happened after this? In Ukraine, it was very strong voice to have really clean prosecutor general, able to investigate high-level corruption. The person who was prosecutor general at the time, I will mention this name, it's Mr. Shokin, but too difficult to remember all these names for Americans, but Mr. Shokin was not the fair prosecutor as he presented now by Mr. Giuliani. He was totally dependent from President Poroshenko, and he was not able to investigate corruption just because he was not the person ready to do this without permission from President. And now he misrepresent himself, saying that he was fair, he was able to prosecute Burisma and Hunter Biden. No. Maybe 7-8 months before this resignation happened, it was very strong campaign to change Prosecutor General, to resign Mr. Shokin. And when it happened, it was spring 2017, 2016, yes. It was not just the result of Vice President Biden efforts. It was big, let's say, coalition for changes in Ukraine and abroad to have fair prosecutor general. It was long time campaign, and he resigned, and he made, let's say, he kept silence for almost 2 years, and only in 2018 he started to present himself as a victim of this intrigue to block prosecution against a company called Burisma. My understanding from inside, it's just fake argument with the idea to help Mr. Giuliani to construct this conspiracy theory. Because my understanding of Mr. Giuliani is that he is trying to be helpful for his client, US President Donald Trump. And to be helpful, he constructed this conspiracy theory with the support of some Ukrainian prosecutors and politicians. But if we look into details, into the timeline, we can see that these events are not relevant, are not connected to each other. And this conspiracy theory is based on like fake ground. It's not real story which really happened in Ukraine.
And just to be clear, it would appear, we don't know this for a fact, but it would appear that Burisma wanted Hunter Biden on its board, was paying him quite a lot of money in order to whitewash their reputation, which was quite bad. And so it's not it's not necessarily an ethical thing, but there's no evidence of any actual illegality in terms of Hunter Biden's role in any of this.
You're right, and I had even some thoughts why in Ukraine it's so popular to have some Americans as a lobbyist, as the guest on conferences or as a members of the board. Ukraine is not Russia, and in Ukraine it's not toxic to have some Americans in the board. It's even honor to have some Americans in your board of company or as a keynote speaker on the conference. Ukrainian oligarchs, they are not Russian oligarchs, they want to be accepted in US. Many of them banned to travel to US. Many of them cannot have a meeting with their counterparts in US or in Europe just because of their poor, crooked reputation. And maybe 15 years ago, it became kind of a mainstream to invite retired American politicians or think tank leaders or spin doctors to construct kind of a reputation cleaning process or just to change the narrative of some oligarch's background. For Mr. Zlochevsky, the former minister who is the owner of this gas company Burisma, it was not a big deal to invite some Americans because it was done by another Ukrainian oligarchs before. And he invited Mr. Biden Jr. with the idea to use him as umbrella. It's clear that he was trying to buy the name Biden. And when it happened, in an anti-corruption movement, in our independent politician establishment, we were not happy with this idea because it was kind of sabotaging of our efforts to clean politics and to fight against corruption. It's important to say that time American ambassador was also quite critical about this fact, and he asked to investigate this organization, Burisma, not to sabotage investigation, but to move forward with investigation. It was done publicly or in one of his regional trips in Ukraine. And all these facts together, they can just destroy this conspiracy theory because instead of keeping silence about this fact, in Ukraine it was very critical voices. Instead of keep eyes blind on this company, American government was very critical about Burisma and so on and so forth.
One of the unfortunate consequences of this whole scandal has been propagation of the notion that all Ukrainians are corrupt.
Yeah, it's not fair. It's not fair because corruption exists everywhere, and if we look on the dynamic in Ukraine, we see positive dynamic because anti-corruption agenda is very strong. For today, for 2019, maybe the less corrupt Ukraine comparing our background maybe from independence, from our past, starting from independence. It's not fair to present Ukraine as a corrupt country now just because the dynamic is very positive. But at the same time, for Ukraine it's a good chance to explain what is really going on because American government spent money of American taxpayers to help Ukraine to construct these anti-corruption institutions and made them quite successful. For instance, this anti-corruption bureau, which I mentioned before, which was responsible for Black Ledger in the beginning, this anti-corruption bureau was created with strong support from FBI and people from FBI permanently present in anti-corruption bureau to provide expertise, to help with mutual cooperation requests, to take information from abroad. And I think it's important to show for Americans that money paid to Ukraine are not wasted. They really invested in creation of necessary infrastructure to fight against corruption and to make Ukraine stronger and to make US safer because Ukraine, strong, safe, independent and prosper Ukraine, it's important issue for the world,
Mhm.
for US interest, for expanding this area of stability in Europe and post-Soviet world. That is why I think it's important to argue with this narrative that
Mhm.
Ukraine is totally corrupt country. And of course, it's a good chance to visit Ukraine and to see by personal eyes what is really going on.
Yeah. Well, Sergei Leshchenko, we're very proud of the role that you played in this. I hope that this is a complicated story, and I think it's important that Americans hear your side and not simply be confused by all of the smoke that's been produced in the impeachment hearings. So, thank you very much for coming back to Stanford, and good luck with this fight against Ukrainian corruption.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
and please invite more and more Ukrainians to Stanford to create these new Ukrainian politicians which able to fight against corruption and to create new Ukraine.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you.